Swinburne University of Technology.
Today for the PhD Hub, I'm talking to Adjunct Professor Janet Bryant, who comes from a sociology background and taught at the university for many years in this area. Janet has a very interesting story as to how she came about her PhD question and her PhD focus. And I think this is a very contemporary story because I think there are many PhDs that may in the future arise in this way. Janet, you might like to tell me the story of how you came about your PhD.
Yes, well, it is a different way of coming to a research question, Joyce. What actually happened was I saw an advertisement in the Age for a PhD scholarship, and so in a way I applied for that scholarship, but it was actually bounded and it was tied to a particular person at the university who was doing research on local government and some political reforms around local government. And they specified both the method that they wanted used, so they wanted to use either ethnography or grounded theory or a combination of that. And they wanted a specific question investigated in relation to this best value reform that was implemented in around 2000 by the newly incumbent Bracks government in Victoria.
So this was a policy question which fits very well with sociology.
Absolutely, and I think there's all sorts of issues related to doing research on changes to social policy, because we can perhaps unpack those a little bit later, but they're certainly, you need to be very timely in the way you deal with these sorts of research questions.
And the methodology that was suggested to you along with the question, would you like to talk about that a little more?
Well, that brings me to thinking about a really important distinction when you're doing your PhD, and that's the distinction between methodology and methods. So what was actually advertised in that advertisement was the methods, which were ethnographic, and there was a suggestion that grounded theory methodology might be used. And so it's important to make that distinction because if you're doing non-traditional research, which in many ways this was, it was going to use an inductive methodology. And I think we could talk briefly perhaps about the distinction between inductive and deductive methodologies, because many students kind of struggle with that at the start of their PhD, what they're doing. So I'm not going to say a lot about deductive methodologies, but that is the traditional PhD, the scientific empiricist approach to doing research.
Yes.
And that's, as you would know, of course, is generally about theory testing. So you're starting with a very, very strictly defined parameters for doing your research with that type of a methodology. You're usually deriving some propositions or hypotheses, as they're called, from a particular existing theory, and you're testing the viability of those.
So that's very much the traditional route, which yours is not going to be.
No, absolutely not. So the second distinction then, of course, is doing inductive research. And grounded theory as a methodology belongs very much to an inductive research model. And my research, of course, was going to go out and investigate a newly implemented policy and what was happening on the ground for people in local government who had to implement this policy. So it was going to go out and use as a method to collect the data in-depth interviewing.
Yes. So
that was the primary method, and of course the other method was ethnographic method. So ethnography, of course, is a very old type of approach to research that was done by the early anthropologists and so on. And of course, much of their work has been challenged in post-colonial frameworks and so forth.
But nevertheless, the method is very useful, and it has, of course, led to autoethnography, which has become a particular modern or postmodern way of writing your PhD, but we don't need to go into that either.
Well, we can, I mean, in a sense, you know, one of my issues on the research journey, which I might talk more about later, was, you know, what was an appropriate method to go out and see what is happening. So inductive methodologies generally are concerned with what's happening on the ground, how are people experiencing particular changes. And that was the right one for this particular research. And I was really keen on ethnographic method anyway. So what I was going to do was go out and talk to all of the people in local government all over Victoria. There's 78 odd municipalities or shires in Victoria, and say, what are you doing? How are you experiencing this? What are the problems with implementing this reform? So you can see it had to be timely. It had to be done quickly, because with a change of government, you know, another change to policy might come about, although in this case not.
And believe me, this is a good hint for all students in the postgraduate world: timeliness. Do it as in a timely a fashion as you can. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100%. If you're going to take on anything that is a current issue in any form or respect, or a current, even something current in the world of literature or film or whatever it might be, you do need to think about timeliness. That's definitely a process issue, and one that we could perhaps explore a little bit.
Right.
For sure.
Now, so you, of course, were already familiar with it. You taught a great deal in these areas. You'd researched a great deal in these areas, and you had initiated, before you took a different life journey, a PhD in this area earlier, hadn't you? So it's not as though you came to this as a neophyte. You came to it with quite a lot of understanding. But being given your PhD question and your PhD focus, how do you think that was for you?
That's an interesting question, Josie, because I'd previously done a master's where there was a very large research component, and I'd done that at Monash University on youth homelessness, which is also was a policy contextualised issue. But that research was set up far more in the traditional model. So we did random sampling of the welfare officers in every Victorian school and so forth. So, yeah, I think it was quite pleasant in a way to come to somebody else's issue, and it was really about new public management and neoliberalism, the reaction to neoliberalism in the 90s when Jeff Kennett collapsed all of the local governments into, there were 250 odd shires and councils in Victoria, and they got collapsed down to 78. So this reform that I was looking at was a bit of a reaction to that sort of contractualisation of local government, and it was an attempt by the Labor government to re-democratise local government, if you like. So yeah, I think it was quite pleasant for me to take someone else's question on, because it wasn't one necessarily that I would have understood as an issue, and it did mean I had to go out and do a lot of boning up on what had been going on in the last decade in terms of these new public management reforms, which were right across politics, you know, from the Commonwealth to the local government level.
And this is very interesting, I think, from the point of view of the contemporary PhD, because I think that more and more questions will come forward, particularly in relationship to wicked questions, to questions which are huge and which really do not have a linear answer. And many people will work on many aspects of them, so questions may well be given, as it were, to the good minds of PhD researchers. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think that's a very, very astute understanding of what's going on. And I think it will happen more and more as change takes place in this way that's quite rapid and very much tied to the waxing and waning of governments, various governments. Yeah.
Yeah. So what other advice might you give to people thinking of undertaking a different method of a contemporary research PhD or master's such as this, or other ideas do you have?
Well, I think, you know, inductive design is nothing new. You know, most qualitative research is based on inductive design, and I see a lot of a big marriage in a way between the type of thesis with exegesis and artefact and this type of inductive design. And I think the important thing, if you're working in this sort of slightly less traditional area of research design, is that you're able to be flexible in the way that you make the journey. So, for example, with grounded theory, even though there's a rigorous process that you have to go through in gathering your data, interpreting your data, reframing your questions, and it's usually done in stages, you still nevertheless have to demonstrate that you've gone through this process quite systematically. Where there's flexibility, though, is things like in a traditional research design, you would normally place your literature review right up at the front of the thesis. You'd have your introduction, your lit review, your methodology, your data and your discussion. There's more flexibility, although you still sometimes have to defend this to the Academy because it's not necessarily widely appreciated. But your process is in the same way that it would be with doing an artefact, an exegesis type of thesis. It's to keep reading as you're gathering the data. And, you know, what you do is this process of memoing where you're keeping a diary, if you like, or a track record of the interface with what you're reading and what you're finding out. And that's helping you modify and reshape your questions. And what you're doing is you're looking for emergent themes.
You're right.
Yeah, emergent themes that are coming out of this interface and that you're hearing from people on the ground who are experiencing a particular genre in your case, or policy change as it was in my case. So I think that this is the really, really important thing, is to realise that you have got that choice. And in my thesis, I decided there would be no literature review. So I had a very brief introduction. I had a background chapter which was really the outcome of, you know, just a bit of an analysis of what had gone on in the past decade or so as a context, an historical context, as it were, for this reform. And then the real discussion, which was where I situated my findings vis-a-vis, you know, what was going on in the academic realm relevant to those findings. That came at the end in my thesis, in the discussion chapter. So you're saying, I found this, and that relates to what this person found. It challenges what this person found. It adds to what this person found. So you're situating what you found vis-a-vis the academy, as it were, at the end of your journey. So it's very much a journey model of doing the PhD, and nevertheless you still have to be entirely rigorous.
That's right. An extremely important aspect of this, which you've revealed to me today, but which I knew, is that it's still scholarship. That because the model changes, it doesn't mean that scholarship and academic rigour flies out the window. So it's bringing together different models with academic scholarship, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Always. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I see it as quite a creative process, because you're generating new knowledge in a sense, you know, by engaging what you're finding and interfacing that with what's already been found. You might be challenging what's already been found, but nevertheless you can't just do it from your heart. You have to do it from a very careful appraisal of existing relevant findings or discourses or narratives in the area.
In the past, the Academy has been very keen on that particular traditional model. We've seen it open up with various models, such as the artefact and exegesis, publications and papers, but I think your model is opening it up even further to possibilities for alternative models to be given stringent academic backgrounds and support and addition to scholarship. So I think it's really, really important that you undertook this PhD in this way, that you are able to reflect upon it, but also that you're able to give incoming PhD students some advice. So what's your advice about getting it done? How did you get it done?
Okay, I think process questions are really important. And we've already touched on the question of timeliness.
That's right.
So if you're doing anything that is current or contemporary or issue-based, you really need to be mindful that this needs to be done in 3 years, if possible, because things change so rapidly. You know, by the time you're writing things up, things might have even changed.
Yes.
And that was the one feedback I got from one of my examiners. He said, "You've looked at new public management. you know, 3 years ago. It's actually moved on from there, and you haven't really got the latest take on that. So that was the one small amendment that I had to do with my thesis.
If I can just interpolate here, I think the university allows students 4 years for full completion of a full-time PhD. However, the university is very keen for all students to complete within 3 years. I'm very keen for students to complete really in a timely manner, not only because things may move on, but also because the students' work becomes stale for themselves. They then begin to become unfocused, to think, well, perhaps this isn't as important as I thought it was, maybe I should look for something else. And the whole package starts, as it were, to fall apart. Do you think that is a problem?
I think it's really important, and I think one of the things is, of course, everybody has a situation where life interferes. But I think if you're about to embark on a PhD or even a master's by research, you have to say, this is something I'm doing for me. This is something I'm doing for my personal satisfaction. And you have to actually make time. Everyone's got a busy life.
That's right.
But there are ways to have found time, and that's tremendously important. And I actually, even though I took this on as a full-time scholarship, I continued working half-time. And one of my ways of getting found time was to get up at 5 in the morning. Yep. And it might have meant I was nodding off on the couch at 8:30 at night or 9 at night. But I found just by getting up and doing that couple of hours really early in the morning, it was my best and most productive time.
And then it's done, isn't it?
It's done, it's done. And you can say I've got a writing block, but then you can do your type of free writing strategies.
So talk to me about facing the blank page.
Okay, you would be familiar with the work of Rowena Murray, I'm sure.
Yes, and she will be one of the links that we will have on the hub.
Well, I would recommend students have a look at Rowena Murray. She's written a couple of books on getting your thesis done. And one of her strategies is to do free writing, which is to get up, face the blank page, and just spend even 5 minutes or less writing anything that comes into your head. And that actually gets you into the right frame. Then you can step back and look at that and think, yes, you know, and extrapolate some ideas to frame your writing. But Josie, if you do that consistent get up in the morning thing,
yes.
Or, you know, your found time, you might be an owl and prefer to work from 11 o'clock till 1 in the morning every night. What you'll find is you finish your period that you allot each day, and of course it will have to be more than 2 hours ultimately, but you finish it with knowing where you want to move on at the next stage.
And I think that's a really good point. If at the end of each day you make a note, tomorrow I will look at. A brilliant
strategy.
And the other thing, of course, as well, where do you get ideas? You are entering into the discussion, as you said, with your literature review going right through. You're entering into the discussion with many other scholars, and that those quotes and those references will take you forward.
Yes.
I notice you've got here that you should build a good relationship with your supervisor. Well, I think that's really significant, isn't it? And it's two-way.
I think it is imperative to recognise, you know, that your supervisor is there to help you, and they're really keen to help you on your way to
We're
achieve
on your
this goal.
side.
Yes, exactly. And I think that it's very easy to be oversensitive or critical of your supervisor. You know, you may think they're not doing enough, or they're doing too much, or they're saying mean things to you, or something like this. But it's in their interest for you to finish. They are a co-researcher with you. And so you have to learn to accept that they are going to say things to you sometimes that you find difficult or confronting. And that's part of your journey. You're not just in conversation with any other part of the academy that's relevant to your field or your question. You know, your primary point of contact is your supervisor. So build a constructive relationship with your supervisor. Don't overstep the mark. Provide them with writing. You know, that's the soundest advice I could offer you. See them regularly. Give them what you've written.
And talk about it.
And talk about it with them. Because sometimes my supervisor wasn't particularly interventionist, but he had the wonderful capacity to say, look, I think you should go and have a look at Joe Blow or such and such. And this was very helpful. And he also pointed me in the direction of getting some publications.
Yes, well, that was the final question I was going to ask you. The PhD is the beginning of the journey on a research life or a research commitment. It's not the end. It's not a dead-end lane.
No.
It's opening up into a big road.
Right.
Where do you think your PhD has taken you, and what sort of thoughts have you got on where it's gone?
Well, I think sometimes it feels like it is the end of the road because it's so consuming. But I think, you know, I was lucky with my supervisor. You know, I wrote an early analysis of my first data set that I'd gathered from my interviews. And he said, look, this is a really pleasing analysis, and because you've been doing that pulling in from the broader literature, you know, you've got some really interesting ideas here. I'd like you to take this to a conference. And so together we put that up for the British Academy of Management, which is a good professional association. And the paper, it was a full paper, and it was accepted at Oxford, and that was such an incredibly wonderful experience.
Yes, congratulations.
And many universities, of course, support students who get accepted. They provide some funding. So I got some funding to help me with that conference. And as an early career researcher, that was really wonderful. Now, this is what I'm really saying to you is you can write while you're doing PhDs. You can get articles and journal publications happening. The second thing that I got out in that 3-year period was I had a bit of a methodological crisis, and I had done one particular interview where it was so compelling. I thought, oh, I don't want to do this kind of coding and thematic analysis with this. Maybe I should be doing, you know, narrative analysis. And so my whole methodological stance was kind of thrown up in the air. Maybe I should be using more of a post-structuralist type of framework for this research. And what I did, you know, my wonderful supervisor said, go away, Janet, and write about it. I went away and wrote about it, and he said, you've got a paper here, you've got another paper here. Yes. And so, you know, he didn't want to go in on that paper because it was sort of away from his area, but he put me in contact with another academic who did. And yeah, so I think that's a start. You can publish while you're doing your PhD, and that's a very exciting and rewarding thing to do. You can publish from your PhD, and of course what you're also getting in the process of being supervised is you're getting experience to supervise and help other people with their writing. So many, many good things can come out of that, building a constructive relationship.
Thank you very much, Janet. Well, Janet's spoken on a number of issues which are relevant, of course, to all of PhD people. The most significant for our purposes is the way in which she went about a contemporary PhD. Thanks again.
Thanks, Josie.
This has been a Swinburne production.